The topic is whether natural law should dictate morality, and implied by that, I guess, is like the assumption that natural law can be like objectively proven to be true.
Or
And
even that it
so,
exists.
yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. So
Right.
maybe I would like explain my perspective first, because you are taking the positive position that it is true and that it can be proven and that we should follow it. So maybe like I can start what I think about morality and all that stuff, so that you can then keep that in mind when you are explaining your worldview.
Go for it.
Okay, yeah, so my perspective is basically I'm a moral anti-realist. I am a utilitarian, but that is only based on my subjective preferences. I don't. Do you know about the is-ought gap? Basically, the idea that you cannot get an ought statement from an is statement.
No, I think I might have heard of it once, but I'm not familiar with the argument, no.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that like morality concerns itself with prescriptive statements, right? While in reality, we only really have, or we only really seem to have descriptive statements. And so the question is kind of like, how do we get from a descriptive statement, or from an is, to a prescriptive statement, to an ought? And my personal view on that is that it can't really seem to be done. So I have some justification for being a utilitarian. I think that generally speaking, our well-being seems to be like the personal goal of most people, like their personal well-being, they want to maximize. But that's again just a personal preference of mine. Someone who wants to maximize suffering, I wouldn't really have an objective argument for why they're wrong. I could only say that I disagree, and we'll probably run into problems there. So yeah, that's my perspective, and I would be curious how you justify a moral realist framework with natural law.
Well, to take on this is ought problem. So what would you think about um, what we observe that if somebody say hits us, right? Um,
If someone
we
hits us,
Yeah, like if somebody hits us, like punches us in the
yeah.
face, for example, we observe that this is a negative phenomenon. So can't we from that reach the ought conclusion that you shouldn't go around hitting people?
No, because clearly there's also people who want to hit others, right? So at that point, all we could do is kind of like make an appeal to the majority consensus, which is that like. But then again, I think that leads us to utilitarianism, because the reason hitting us is bad is because it hurts us, which decreases our well-being. But yeah, no, as I said, like I would say that like at most you could like justify morality, I guess, like intersubjectively, in the sense that like, as I said, it's based on consensus in a way. But even then, I don't see a reason to like say that objectively speaking, those who go against the majority consensus must be definitively wrong. And I think we can kind of see that if we like assume alternative hypotheticals in which the majority holds something that we consider immoral to be objectively right. So, for example, you are a libertarian, right? So you
Correct.
probably hold that like taxation is objectively incorrect, objectively wrong.
Right.
Yeah, but like the majority of people holds taxation to be something that's fair and that's morally either neutral or even beneficial. So I don't. So and you would say that like in that case, either maybe the majority is being inconsistent in their values, or they haven't considered a certain thing. And in that case, we are already kind of like tapping into why the consensus isn't really that which determines morality.
Yeah, I agree that the majority shouldn't dictate. I do think that morality is objective. That there's certain acts which which are wrong and are wrong regardless of what anybody else thinks. Um, and we see almost every society has criminalized or condemned these acts: theft, assault, murder. Um, so you don't believe in objective morality at all?
I don't. I would like to believe in it because that would make my job a lot easier because it is very annoying to argue with people and then be like, oh well, I want to maximize well-being and that's why I want this, and then they're like, well, I don't care about that. Then we're just like kind of at an impasse because neither of us can convince the other of their moral framework. So I definitely want objective morality to be true, but I don't really see a way to make it true aside from like I don't see a way to make it true at all, to be honest. I don't think some kind of majority consensus would make it true. I
I
think
have
that
the
would just
same
make it a bit
issue.
closer to.
I have the same issue with the concept of free will in that I want it to exist, but I don't see how rationally it can.
Oh yeah, I would probably agree on that, but yeah.
But
Would you agree that like
good.
free will doesn't really have much of an impact on morality in that sense? Because like, well, if we only have free will in a figurative sense or in like a metaphysical sense, doesn't really matter to our actions, right?
But when it comes to condemning people for their actions, I mean, if they're not making the choice, if it's just predetermined, I don't see how you can condemn anybody for anything.
Well, we kind of condemn them in the sense of like, well, I would say we should condemn their actions, and by if they made like, let me think. I would say condemning them kind of, it's not necessarily contingent on free will. It's more like we condemn. It's similar how we might like condemn an earthquake for doing a lot of damage, right? The earthquake didn't choose to do it, but we can still consider it kind of an evil, even though like it literally lacks any intention.
So, to get back to our original discussion on natural law, um,
Yeah, we are already kind of getting off topic.
it's bound to happen. So, the way I understand natural law, and perhaps I have some misconceptions here, but basically the idea is that there's certain principles that we can discern simply through the use of our own reason. Um, so, so for example, self ownership. We look around. Um, it seems obvious that everybody should be able to own themselves. That nobody should be able to own somebody else simply by our understanding of human nature and that people are individuals and slavery is wrong. So shouldn't there be principles that we can deduce simply on the fact that people are self-aware and based on our observations of individuals and our observations of ourselves and what it feels like when our rights are invaded against, our self-ownership is invaded against through aggression, through theft. Shouldn't there be these basic laws, natural laws?
Well, firstly, I'm not sure if self-ownership is that obvious, right? Because throughout history, there have been many people just straight up not believing in it. I mean, slavery has been with us for about all of human history until very recently. I'm sure even I know even like nowadays in many parts of the world it's still practiced to some extent. So I'm not sure if self-ownership is such an obvious moral principle. I would generally be inclined to agree with self-ownership because it seems to, well, to some extent, right? Like, for example, I would hold self-ownership to be true conditionally. Basically, to me, since I'm entirely focused on outcomes rather than broader principles, self-ownership would be true until holding it to be true reaches a certain threshold of negative outcomes. So, for example, I think drunk driving is a really easy example for that, right? You aren't infringing on anyone's rights by driving your car while drunk, but you are risking the lives of others. So, at that point, we are kind of like infringing on your self ownership and your property rights to do with your car what you wish to make sure that this risk of to other people's life is lessened.
Drunk driving is an interesting example because Walter Black controversially called for its legalization, sort of, in that how can you combine two actions that aren't a crime and come up with a crime with the proviso that in a libertarian society, the roads would be privately owned, so drunk drivers could be prohibited in that manner because it does seem obvious that drunk driving should be prohibited. But I wanna ask you about utilitarianism. Isn't there a problem with utilitarianism in that we don't know, we have very little understanding of what the outcomes of anything are going to be. Um, for example, you're walking along the water and there's somebody drowning, you know, a woman drowning. You go and save her, she's a perfectly fine person, but it just so happens that her child is going to become the next Adolf Hitler or whatever, the very worst person could be. It's going to do some terrible thing, so isn't it? We can't really predict the outcome of any action.
Yeah, I would argue that decisions like these have to be made probabilistically, right? Like if I save a woman who's currently drowning from dying, then the chance of her son being like this great moral monster would be so low that it's barely even worth considering. It would basically be like you walking out and being randomly being hit by an anvil who someone a few floors over you drop down. It's like yeah, basically, I would just say probabilistic decision making seems to be kind of like how we make decisions in the first place. You aren't constantly worried about anything that could possibly happen to you, and the same would apply to moral decision making in that sense. You try your best to like weigh the different chances of the different realistic chances of different outcomes, and then you just go with the one that seems the most reasonable. Obviously, with like some margin of error. So like, if there's like a great risk involved, like let's say like you have like no, let's make this abstract. You have like some choice that has a 50% has a 51% chance of like increasing the well-being of everyone involved, right? Everyone in the entire world just gets like is suddenly made happy, can suddenly fulfill, can suddenly meet their needs better, can suddenly is like filled with the strong sense of purpose for what they want to do in their lives and have an easy time doing. Well, not easy because that kind of infringes on purpose, but yeah, basically just everyone is happier, right? And then the 49% chance would be that like, oh, suddenly hell on earth breaks loose. We are all suffering. And in that case, I don't think it would be reasonable to make the 51% chance for goodness, just because it's slightly higher probabilistically. I would say that like we should make sure to not take risks that are too high, because then we are basically just doing moral gambling, which seems to be bound to produce very negative
Plus,
outcomes in the long
what
run.
you're gaining isn't as valuable as what you're losing. So, even if you had like an 80% chance of some positive outcome, if you're losing more in that 20%, if you're losing 10 or 20 times as much, like you can't just go for whatever the highest probability is. You have to consider the expected value of everything that you can calculate. But I think that is a good answer about probabilistic determination. Um,
And yeah, I agree that obviously like the value you actually get out of it is obviously
Mhm.
also really important. I would say it's kind of like, and a lot of people criticize utilitarianism for like how exactly would you like quantify the value, right? But I think that is kind of an unfair challenge to utilitarianism because other systems have kind of the same issue, right? Like if you look at a deontological system or a system based around virtue ethics, you can't really quantify the inherent goodness of an act or the inherent virtue that an action implies about the actor. And so, just like with these systems where we kind of like have to guesstimate how good an action might be, the same just applies to utilitarianism. We have to make assumptions based on what people say they want and what we know about human psychology, and then act on
Well,
that.
there's nothing wrong with a qualitative analysis, anyways. Not everything can be reduced to numbers. That's one of my major criticisms
Exactly.
of the modern economics profession is that everything is uh, quantitative and based on statistics, but that's not always the best way. Sometimes that can be useful, but it's not always the best way of getting at the truth.
Maybe I would definitely have to look more into that to make a definitive statement on that. But regardless, where did we leave off with natural
Well, you were
law?
you were
But the last point you made was about.
You expressed some
Yeah.
skepticism about self ownership,
Oh yeah.
and then I'm not sure where we were after that.
But basically, how would you prove self-ownership to me as a utilitarian, who would say that whether we should allow self-ownership or not depends on the outcomes of the context we allow it in?
Um,
Like, how would you prove that I'm definitively wrong
yeah,
in saying that?
that's a good question. I'm not sure. I guess self ownership seems to me to be self evident that who else should own me but me. I don't see a good case for why I should be the slave of somebody. I think that the fact that, I mean, I don't want to appeal to the majority, but the fact that virtually everybody rejects ownership of others um, would seem to be
Well, that's the point I made at the start, though, right? That like that hasn't been the case for the vast
yeah.
majority of human history, right? Like the slave owners in America, like just a century ago, like they do. I don't know. Yeah, like they didn't hold that like, oh, no other human being should possibly be owned, right? Some of them even had like arguments that they considered reasonable that obviously nowadays don't hold up, but they even had like internal logic of like, oh yeah, black people, they just can't they just can't handle the freedom a white man can, right? Obviously, that's flawed from the modern perspective, but I don't think that like I just see it as an example for like how self ownership isn't
Right.
self evident. It's something that human beings have doubted for the vast majority of human history, for sometimes better reasons than sometimes worse reasons. But I would say mostly worse reasons, right? Like I don't think there's any time in human history where like slavery was
Yeah.
like a justified institution. But we are digressing again. It's just not something that humans generally seem to be drawn to the same way they would, for example, be drawn to the example you named at the start, where like, oh, hitting me is bad. Although even then, right, there's consensual hitting when you get into like fighting competitions, BDSM, like that. Hitting someone is bad isn't like
Or
a
the use of
universal
force in
statement. It's
self
more like
defense.
hitting me is bad. Oh yeah, of course, yeah. Basically, it's like it already is contingent on like certain
Right. It's
conditionals,
more
right?
that aggression is bad rather than the use of force per se.
Even there, I would have called that into question. Like, for example, let's say you have two countries, right? One country is like, let's say you have like one country that's like a monarchist state, very libertarian. The individual rights of everyone are being respected, productive outcome is optimal, all these good things, right? And next to it, you have like the ultimate communist nightmare, right? North Korea. Everyone is enslaved to the state. Everyone is toiling away for bare subsistence standard, if even that. Wouldn't you say that, like in cases like these, aggression against the other force might be justified?
Well, it seems that it would. I mean, I don't think there's any historical parallels where that happened, where you like invaded another country, liberated everybody, and things went well. Obviously, in the example,
Yeah, because a lot of countries are like self-interested, right? So I'm only making a hypothetical here. I'm not saying like, oh, historically most wars have been fought for just
right?
because of the goodness of the attacker, right? That doesn't
No,
generally
I mean,
hold
I
to
don't
be
know if it's
true.
ever been true.
I'm sure it's been sometimes, right? Like maybe like in the Second World War, right? Like the Allies attacking Nazi Germany. That was probably like a cause most of us could
Yeah,
get behind.
it's interesting though. Like what would have happened if America had stayed out? Um, what would have happened to the Russian people if the Soviet system had collapsed under the weight of the Nazi assault? I mean, who knows? Obviously, nobody knows how the past would have played out. Um,
Yeah, so basically, I'm not sure if I would. Basically, that would be my reason for why I don't think aggression is universally wrong. And then, another example would be like you would hold taxes, for example, to be a form of aggression, right? Because it contingents on
right.
the threat of coercion. Yeah, and to me, it seems very clear that like taxes have pretty good outcomes overall. That's obviously not the topic of the debate, so that's something we could get into another time, whether that is even true. But if we assume, for the sake of the argument, that taxes have good outcome, it would be a good example for why the use of aggression might be
It's a big
justified in certain
assumption, though.
cases. And you know, yeah, well, if taxes didn't have good outcomes, then it wouldn't be a problem for me as a utilitarian, right? Then I wouldn't have to assume that aggression is always wrong. I would just have to assume that well-being is always good and suffering is always bad, and we should maximize one and minimize the other. And then from that, we could just follow up on,
Right.
taxes being bad. Like, I would have to make less assumptions for taxes being bad than you would have to do on like just calling them intrinsically wrong based on aggression, which would be intrinsically wrong
There's
based on
definitely
that and
some
that and that.
examples where, you have to concede that taxes seem good. I mean, you can't really measure the utility that one person has versus another. Like, but if you take, you tax a billionaire and you use that money to build a healthcare clinic, it seems like the good done. There's a lot more benefit than the harm to the billionaire, right? So I'd concede that. But I think there's a real moral hazard too that when you have an organization like the state that's collecting money through coercion, um, and being able to spend that money on anything, there's a real moral hazard in that a lot of the times you don't end up with healthcare clinics or schools. You end up with fighter jets and bureaucrats that aren't really doing anything but are getting a good salary.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm absolutely for decentralization and democratization, right? Like my ideal system would be far more local and far more have give people far more options for like democratic input and democratic control over
Well,
their
that's
elected
why capitalism
representatives. But even then, we are
that's why
like talking
capitalism
about outcomes
originated
again,
in
right?
Europe in the first
Like
place was because it had a much more decentralized system. And by capitalism, I mean the modern market economy, because the word capitalism can mean a lot of different things, right?
yeah,
Some of
sure.
them pejorative, but because it was decentralized and people could sort of vote with their feet and decide where they wanted to go, you ended up with better outcomes.
Well, actually, I would kind of call that into question. In early Europe and early industrial Europe, there was like a lot of issues with like farmers essentially being forced to move into the city because that's the only place where they could like make a proper living. And then in the city, of course, like the factory condition and all that was fucking atrocious. It was like absolutely terrible. So like the early industrial revolution is definitely not a good example you want to use for like capitalism's superiority. I would say the good parts of
The
capitalism probably
conditions in the
come a bit later
factories
than that.
were
But yeah,
terrible
I see your
compared to
point. I
what we
mean,
have today. But people, the thing is, like at the time, like say 19th century England, for example, there was a real problem because the population was growing, and the economy at that point was very like I guess feudal. You could say like if you were if you were like a merchant, and then your son would take over from you. So there was like a spot for only so many people in the economy. They all these basic economic fiefdoms, and then but the population was growing, and there were all these people that there was no place for them in the economy. So the factory system that actually by producing goods for the people and creating work for them. Yes, conditions were awful. I agree, relative to standards of today, but they improved rapidly over 100 years because of the capital accumulation and the increased productivity.
I mean, yeah, it's kind of like a big point about like Marxist or I guess Yeah, I guess Marx's analysis that like history isn't just driven by like evil and good people who are like driving society, right? It's like it's in large part driven by just the material conditions of the time. So I would agree with that. That it's like it's not all just like, oh, the evil capitalists want to make the workers of the 19th century suffer. It's also like just material necessity in part. So yeah, I agree with that. But I want to kind of come back to the issue that like right now we are still talking about outcomes, right? And if you want to prove that like coercion is always bad, you can't do that based on outcomes. Even if we like, find so many cases where like, oh, here's an example of coercion being bad, here's an example of coercion being bad, here's an example where we might justify it, but it's kind of a gray zone. We are still fundamentally talking about outcomes. We aren't talking about a more deontological system like natural law that just says coercion is
Right, right. No,
universally
I
bad.
agree. Um, and let me just say, I'm not really, I don't have the proper background in philosophy to really argue this case very well. So I wish I did. You've obviously got an excellent command of the
That's yeah,
ideas,
we
and I
can.
wish that I had studied more in this area because I think we could have a fruitful discussion in that case. But yeah,
That's fair. I think we can still have a good discussion, right? And, like, I'm not saying because of this you
yeah.
absolutely have to stop believing in natural law, right? No, right? I assume at some point you're gonna like read up more about it, and then like maybe you'll find like the perfect counter to all the things I'm saying right now, right? It's just like right now those are the
Yeah,
questions I'm kind of
yeah,
asking
no,
myself, and
absolutely. You've definitely
yeah.
identified a few areas for me to study, and um, yeah, I agree though that it's not about the outcomes. There's got to be something about the act itself. Um, why?
I guess a branch I could offer you is like since I'm a moral anti-realist, right? Would you maybe like for the time being take the anti-realist position that like natural law isn't definitively provable, but it's something you personally think just leads to the best outcomes and to the best it is just
Yeah, that
what is
certainly
generally most conductive to human well-being.
that
Because that's
certainly
in my
seems
opinion
like a
would be a more
reasonable
defendable
position.
position. And that's something that
Like at a certain point, I think that you do have to assert things. Be it property rights, and that's actually something I've thought before. In discussions where people are saying, "Well, why is property justified?" I think at a certain point, you just have to look at human history, and property seems to be a good system, so you just sort of assume it because you think it's going to lead to the best outcome.
mm, well, as a socialist, I would obviously disagree with that, right? But that gets into like a whole nother topic about like the profit motive, the structure,
Right.
the hierarchy between capitalist and
Perhaps
worker.
we do.
I don't know if we want to get into that right now, but
Well, I mean, there's two of
oh, do
us,
we?
so it's who knows? Well, I guess we both know.
But yeah, I don't know. I guess do you have like a let me think about how to phrase it. Like, do you have like a concrete, more like a more like well, for example, like, could you make a logical syllogism on why property rights are necessary for human flourishing? Like, and I mean like more of a deductive argument rather than an inductive one, because inductive would be look at this, look at this, look at this. Here's like a lot of examples. But I first want to see like, do you have like maybe anything that like you could point to that directly leads us to property rights? Something that like some argument that like we could just talk about on its own merits, and if it turned out to be true, then I would have to believe in
No,
inviolable
I don't think I
property rights.
do. I mean, I'm sure there are valid arguments out there, but none that spring to mind. I mean, um, well, the way that I view property rights is they're first established through homesteading, right? So you have the state of nature, and then you mix your labor with the land, and that becomes yours. That's how you own it because you improve it, I guess. But as to why that should be, as opposed to say anybody just being able to use it, I mean, maybe I think I don't have a solid moral justification. I should, but I guess I don't.
Yeah, well, I as a utilitarian would argue that generally property rights and especially the accumulation of important property, of important capital, generally seems to lead to hierarchies which allow some to assert their self-interest over that of others, right? But basically, for example, like if you have like a good example for that would be, for example, factory towns in the early US and even to some extent today, where there's one factory that's owned by a private capitalist, and the entire town around it is just based on labor in that factory. So basically, everyone in the town is dependent on work in that factory. And I think that leads to a lot of outcomes where the private owner of that factory has just so much power over the town and the people in it that they can't freely choose their own, that they can't freely make their own choices anymore. Because, I mean, essentially what power is, right, at its core, is the ability to assert your self-interest over the environment around you and others. And so if you have more economic power than another person, naturally that's gonna apply there. Like you have all this economic power by virtue of people being dependent on you for their livelihood. So you can make them do things that are more in your self-interest than it is in theirs. And obviously it's still like a voluntary interaction, so it's not like both parties aren't getting anything out of it. Like the worker still prefers to work in the factory over starving to death. But clearly there's like an imbalance in which in how much the interaction benefits each participant, right? Because the capitalist has far more power to set the wages, to make sure to not make certain workplace safety measures just because he doesn't
Well,
need to, because people will
going
work there
back
anyways.
to nature, like if somebody were to build a farm, like a small farm, that would be a clear improvement, right? That wouldn't be you're not lording anything over anybody.
Yeah.
Um, and we clearly want to incentivize. Um, well, I think anyway. You might disagree. We want to incentivize, when we are in that state of wild, to transforming it to conditions which better serve people. Like a farm, you grow food, feed the community. That's a great thing, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I agree that we fundamentally need some kind of mechanism which
Yeah. So,
incentivizes
but would the person
creation.
who built that farm be able to own it? Would it belong to the community? How would that work in your view, in your ideal system?
Obviously, my ideal system wouldn't just like emerge randomly in the wild, right? Like, like it comes down to what you said earlier with like how the industrial revolution, a lot of the bad things there were contingent on material conditions, right? So equally, we could argue that like from the wild societies which arise just randomly there would always kind of be subject to a tribal structure. And then as we advance, we get to feudalism, capitalism, and in my view, then from that would eventually get to socialism, right? But essentially, my idea would be so we can incentivize the labor that goes into establishing the farm just by compensating the labor, right? We can incentivize the idea that went into making the farm or the skill by just like, but then by the time the farm is created, I don't think there's much need to still have the ownership of the farm in the hands of the individual who built it, right? Because he has been compensated for his labor already. Now, in an actual socialist society, I would argue that like if someone wants to make like a small private farm or whatever, go ahead. It doesn't infringe on anything that we've built up. You can still have your small family-owned restaurant. You can have your small farm. You'll just like you just won't be part of like the broader socialist apparatus. You'll just have to like trade with it as an
So,
external participant. And if that's what you want, that's fair. We more so get into issues when we get into like huge accumulations of
so your
power
view
and
of
more
socialism is
complicated
sort of a
economic structures.
stateless, non-hierarchical society where people
Not necessar not necessarily stateless. I used to believe in somewhat of a stateless society, but then we also get into
Yeah.
into the topic of what a state even is, and gosh, is that a headache? But I would say nowadays I would consider myself maybe like more of a minarchist, or maybe like a knight. Like I would probably want localized or regional governments, and then like maybe like a national government on top that has very little control, that's like only setting the very broad directions of society, as in like, oh hey, maybe we shouldn't just kill each other randomly, or and then also takes care of stuff like foreign policy, because that's and kind of coordinates the interactions between the different societies, because that seems something that can quickly go wrong and that needs some level of coordination. But yeah, I'm also in favor of kind of like incremental movement towards that. So a lot of that stuff is kind of like contingent on experimentation. Like I wouldn't just want to immediately snip the finger and now we are in a minarchist, libertarian socialist society. I would want to like probably start off with market socialism, then we slowly like build decentrally planned structures, democratize the government more, decentralize it more, and that sort of stuff. Basically, I would kind of want to avoid the risks that come
Yeah.
with
Well, it seems the
revolution and rapid
dictatorship of the
change in a
proletariat
society.
hasn't worked out well. So definitely need some alternative means of achieving the socialist society, if that's your goal.
Yeah, I'm definitely like, I mean, the dictatorship of the proletariat is like such a, I guess in one way a loaded word, and another way a really vague word, right? Because like if you ask Marxists what they think or the dictatorship of the proletariat is, they'll just say, oh, a society in which the working class is in charge, which like great, that could mean a lot of different things, right? But I would say what I'm definitely opposed to is like the idea of a vanguardist revolution, or just generally the idea of a vanguard. I think the idea of having a certain group of, I guess, very revolutionary minded people lead the revolution for the workers just seems fundamentally flawed, at least in like modern first world countries. That just leads to situations where like while after the revolution is done, they like the entire revolutionary structure is just based on the small group of people, right? So they can very easily use that to further their own gains, or use that to like, like even if they are perfectly moral human beings, right? They are still flawed by virtue of being a human, so they
My
can still make wrong
my
decisions just with all the power they have. So yeah, I'm definitely.
my
Long
my
story short,
understanding of
I'm for
Marxist theory is
decentralization.
not 100%, but um,
Oh, neither is mine. I would say I'm more of a revisionist, or like, I guess I take a little bit from Marx,
right,
but
right. You've
I'm not
got
like a
your own
hardcore
view,
Marxist or an
but do
orthodox
you hold
Marxist.
that that basically um, that society has to go through basically industrial capitalism before socialism? Like that was the problem in the Soviet Union, was they went to socialism too early. Is that your view?
I would say that industrial capitalism arose for a reason, and I would say there were definitely benefits to going over it before moving to a different stage. I'm sure there's like, as I'm sure you know, there's like so many different models of how socialism might function, and I'm sure there's some out there that might be better than capitalism, but that's kind of where we get into like the debate between scientific socialism and idealism. It's like, even if I think that this model of socialism might be better, might have been better at industrializing society and then immediately lead to socialism, it's like I can't just implement that by advocating for it. If like all the material conditions point in this direction. I guess my answer to the question would just be it's complicated. On the one hand, I think there is a good argument for historical materialism. On the other hand,
I think
I'm not
as
sure if
well
it's
as
as absolute as some
material
Marxists believe it is.
conditions affecting the course of history, it's also important to recognize the power that ideas can have. I believe that more than the
Oh
actions
yeah,
of
absolutely. I think
individuals, I think
Yeah.
that ideas really have the power to shape history and to mold change.
I think ideas in the political sense of like, oh, I have this particular ideology and want this particular political system. I think those kinds of ideas don't have a lot of power. But ideas that do have a lot of power would, for example, be like the Enlightenment, the discovery of the scientific method, all that kind of stuff. Like that seemed to have like a large impact. Also, like if we go like a millennia earlier, like 2 millennia earlier, like the rise of Christianity and stuff like that. Like all of that seemed to have like a huge impact on society and like the way we organized our structures. So I definitely think ideas do have an important impact. I just think like more broadly applicable ideas probably have like a bigger impact than okay, I have this particular idea in my head of like how a society could function, and I'm not now going in the woods with a bunch of people to build a commune there and try it out. I think those kinds of ideas are
You make a
less
good point.
relevant than
In reference
the ones I've
to
named.
Christianity, even the different sects of Christianity had a profound impact, um, like on economic thought, where the English thought was very influenced by Calvinism, and thus very focused on hard work and savings and labor, and then the the Catholic countries were more focused on consumption and the consumer. So that had a strong impact on the way that economic conditions were analyzed. So there's definitely, and I'm sure if we looked at other societies and other religions, you would see the same phenomena. I can't point to any specifics, but I do agree with you that yeah, like not ideas in the sense of political campaign even, or yeah, I have this idea that I'm gonna remake the world, but ideas in the popular sense too, like free trade became very popular, and that had a profound impact because um, even though there was a big problem that like if somebody benefits from a barrier to free trade, like or for example the or the steel industry, they put up a tariff on the import of steel. Well, the cost to each consumer is very small, because it's spread across however many millions of people. But the benefit to that one company is huge. So they have a big incentive to lobby Congress or whatever, depending on your system of government. Um, and that was the public choice argument, was that it was a fatalistic or pessimistic argument, saying because the self-interested benefit so much more than the people who are sort of subjugated to pay for this, um, that you couldn't have the progress, but because the idea of free trade became very popular, it sort of won out, at least in some countries, or at one period of time it won out.
Yeah, I'm just I guess not educated enough on the topic to like make a definitive claim on the historical context in which free trade became
Mm.
more popular. But it is a like it's a possible thesis, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.